Hello, I would like to introduce the cnōc, or if you end up with a pair of them, then you've got a knock-knock. This is a very versatile multifunction utility module, essentially. It is a function generator, fundamentally. Attack release, variable AR, variable shape, linear or exponential. It can cycle, so you can run it as an LFO. So you got function generation, LFO modulation, CV over attack and release independently, ASR versus AR. Yeah, it's a very powerful device, which circuit-wise, it's kind of a classic. It's a much more of a West Coast focused envelope in comparison to the CES, which is the sort of East Coast counterpart. I mean, a more traditional ADSR. There are many ways to patch with the cnōc, and we kind of designed it and boiled it down to being just a single channel AR. So they suit well being paired or tripled as a cascadable patching quadrature environment, or you can run it as a CV processor, so slew limiter, logic extractor, I guess low pass filter is possible as well. It's a fun one, and there's going to be quite a number of patch examples in this video, so I'll dive right in. Maybe let this play for a bit because it's quite an interesting, Krell patch type generative stereo wave shaping patch, which I might revisit at some point for an instructional patching video. Hope you enjoy. Cheers. Okay, let's talk about the cnōc. I'll do a quick run through, just top to bottom, talking through the ins and outs, and then we'll quickly start diving into some patch examples, showing it in context, because that'll be much more fun. Top right here, we have our primary envelope output. So this is a unipolar positive CV output. 0 volts to 10 volts, attack release. The output to the left of it is simply a duplicate of this output, which is DC offset negative. So it means that the peak to peak 0 to 10 volts is now -5 to +5. This comes into play nicely when the cnōc is set to cycle. So it's now no longer really an envelope generator and more an LFO. So triangle LFO in this case. Or we could offset it to being sawtooth one way or the other way, depending on the ratio between attack and release times. Cool. Okay, let's look at the other outputs that are in this top cluster of jacks. This is the end of cycle trigger. So here you can see we've got the main envelope on the blue trace, and we've got the visible trigger signal on the end of each cycle. So this can be very useful as a clocking mechanism, timing source within a patch. And it always occurs at the same position at the end of the release section. And this can also come from a one-shot cycle as well. There we go. I'm trying to see that happening. Cool. Okay, let's look at cycle this again. Set this to normal. There we go. Let's look at the gate output. So there's a toggle switch for the gate, and you can choose whether it's sourcing the gate output from either the attack or the release. So here in the scope we can see the green portion, which is variable based on my attack time, and the off state duration based on my release time. You can choose whether that's attack based or release based for its gate source. To the left of that is a shape toggle, so this changes between exponential or linear. So depends on the patch context, whether you're wanting a bit more of a natural percussive plucky sound, then exponential will definitely be the way to go. And maybe slower control ramps, that'll be linear. The gate output can be a very useful utility for curating clock signals or binary state signals. So say you've got a trigger and you want that to be a defined gate duration, then you would use the attack section. And the duration defined by the attack is the duration of the resulting gate. On the flip side, you could put it on release and use this as a trigger delay. So here I'm triggering it when I press a button, and the duration of the attack is offsetting the actual produced trigger pulse. So yeah, some handy utility use cases there. Let's talk frequency range of the cnōc when it's cycling. There we go. I'll run this through a filter so we can actually hear it, because it will go up into audio rate. There we go. Triangle, sawtooth. So the range of durations, shortest attack, shortest release with the faders, that sits ballpark around 1 kilohertz. We give or take a bit of deviation module to module, but it's been pretty accurate during testing of the production boards. 1 kilohertz, and that will go down to, it's roughly 20-second cycle time, so 10-second attack, 10-second release. Which range-wise, this is based on some classic staples in the genre of looping AR or function generators in modular. CV inputs for attack and release. So if I just patch this from a 1F manual control. There we go. There we go, CV control over that. If we send negative CV, there is a little extra headroom to shorten the attack or release durations. So say you're doing something very exponential, then you might want to pull that down a little bit more to get an even quicker pulse. But for pluckiness, I think it's got a very musically useful range. Okay, let's look at the mode switch. So in the center position, this is our one-shot envelope to the right, and it's cycling. And it'll also self-kick, so anytime you go from a stalled state into cycling, it forces oscillation. And then on the left is ASR mode. So to show that, let's pull in a gate signal from the cease. So I'll just have this a fixed duration of attack. Put in auto, slow it down a bit. There we go. If I increase attack and release, attack, sustain, release. That's it. So when you're in attack, sustain, release, or attack, hold, release, is ASR, the button will always operate as a one-shot trigger, which effectively soft syncs the envelope core. So if it's in its attack phase, Pressing the button will jump it immediately to release. So for ASR functionality, you'll need to patch a gate signal specifically to the input jack. In looping mode, it's the input jack is it's a reset command. So if it's in the release stage, it will force it back to its attack. There we go. Okay, let's do something musical with this. I'm just going to patch up a basic subtractive voice. Come from the crew in here, which is the new stereo super saw. I'll just use the summed mono output and run that through the low pass filter. Cool, okay. Let's put this into exponential response and use it as both a clock source for a percussive control and have it function as the CV source over my VCA. So the croon here has got a VCA built in at the top. Cool, and what I can do to show the use of both outputs, I'll use the bipolar output and I'll use that to control my cutoff frequency because my primary cutoff control is essentially a bias starting point. Then I can use this envelope through the FM input. So this envelope controlling both VCA and low pass filter, we're very much in low pass gate type territories, and the exponential curve is very snappy, so it's quite reminiscent of a classic Vactrol low pass gate, but a bit more control via CV in this instance. There we go, that's sounding pretty good. Okay, let's expand this a bit more and get a bit more melodic. I'm going to use the end of cycle trigger, use that to clock my sample and hold down here, and then I'll quantize that into being a volt per octave source for the croon. So now, double use case of the cnōc, it's both the envelope that's controlling the VCA and the filter, and it's also the clock source for random voltage generation, with the timing of the whole patch being controlled from the attack and release parameters. So this is us kind of getting into generative patching techniques, which is a really, that's where function generators like the cnōc really sort of sit at home. I'm going to use this same random voltage source and patch that to my release time. This is kind of us getting into Krell patch territory. Okay, let's add one additional external factor. I'm going to use an LFO. I'll just pull from the oct here and use this to modulate the attack time. So this is kind of the additional random element where we've got variation coming via the tie, which is clocked by the cnōc, which is telling the cnōc how long to wait between clock pulses for our pitch selection. And there's a random swing over the attack duration, controlled by an additional LFO. To keep things on brand, let's use a second cnōc as that LFO. In this case, we've got a bit more control because we can offset the shape of the controlling modulation signal. I'll patch this through the scope. We'll be able to see the modulation control over the attack. Linear shaping over a VCN filter. So there's maybe a bit more prominence with the brightness through the filter in the linear. So the cutoff's opening up and it's a slower reduction in cutoff frequency compared to exponential, where things are much more plucky. There we go. Let's get into something a bit more musically generative, I think. A lot of it's just a trial and improvement of playing about with ratios of timing control. So, you know, the depth of modulation of my random voltage, that's going to affect the ranges of release tail, which fundamentally is controlling the timing of the clocking of the pitch. So everything's generative in this sort of context. Yeah, that's showing quite a few ins and outs of the cnōc in its own cycling self-clocking state. So yeah, a few other patches to explore next. Okay, next up I want to show the cnōc in the use case of being a triggered relay. I'm going to do this with a harmonic voice that's similar to patch I did for the Croon's recent overview video. So I'm going to be using 3 1047s as resonant filters. I'll tune them all to a unison to start with, and this is going to be controlled from the harmony. So I'm essentially going to have root 3, 5 mixed together in what I'll do. I'll use the same stereo patch technique I used because it's quite fun, and the timing is going to be derived from these 3 nōcs, which I'll cascade. So there will be like a strum where it's like plucking through with a time duration between each one, but clocked from a single source. Yeah, quite a lot going on, but this is the main focus will be with the cnōc control. So let me quickly patch up my harmonic voice. So I need a mult. So this will be my root, and I'm going to send that to both left and right together, and then I'll do some stereo patching, keeping the 3rd of the chord to the left and the 5th of the chord to the right. Go, and this will go to left and right. Okay, let's patch up the harmony. Root 3rd and 5th. So root is going to this one, 3rd and 5th. And let me tune this to its unison. Have the left and right swapped. That's fine, so it'll be root 3rd, 5th. Cool. Okay, let's take these out of self-oscillation and let's control some triggers. So to start with, I'll use this cnōc as my root, as my primary clock. I'm going to come from the gate output and have this set to release. So anytime there's a trigger derived from the release tail, that's going to ping my root note. There we go. And same for the next one. So we 3rd, and then same for this one. So now the trigger delay aspect, if I increase my attack times, I'm creating a delay between each note. So I'll bring the delay down on my root, and let's use this cycling cnōc up here as my main clock. So this is gate source coming from the attack stage. Actually, I've done this wrong. So these need to come from the end of cycle triggers. So that's my striking source. I then use my gate source as my delayed aspect for cascading. That's the trick. Here we go. So gate output, and that's going to trigger the next. Low delay. And I can set a delay time via the attack duration. Let's cascade the next one. now let's use my original clock source, clock a sample and hold, and then use this as random voltage to define my root. There we go. And if I want to add variation to the timing of all this, all I need to do is add CV modulation to my attack durations. Patch cable count is pretty high on this because I'm discretely patching 3 resonant filters, but the premise can be applied to many different patch contexts. And things can be as tight or as random as you want. What we'll do is I'll mult this coming from my random voltage. So now using the same random voltage to control both the attack and the 2 attack stages. So now with a higher fundamental note, we get a degree of consistency. So if there's a close enough random voltage, it's going to give the same fundamental pitch, giving us the same chord, but the timing is going to vary. A bit more organically, I think. For this next example, I'm going to focus in on the cnōc in an ASR mode functionality, but not specifically as an ASR envelope. So I'll start by patching up a basic subtractive voice. So this will just be, I'll use the wavefolder output of the cnōc and run that through this filter. Cool. Okay. I'll get this in a position where I can use the envelope to control the timbre parameter. So I'll use the wavefold depth in this instance. So here we are, currently in typical one-shot mode. So this is AR functionality. So as we'd expect, attack and release linear ramps, and we've got some nice smooth opening closing of the wavefold depth. I'm going to use a gate signal to control this. So in this case I'll come from the cease down here, which is just a gate follower, no attack, decay or release, and patch this in here. So you can see even if it's a short trigger, the single shot mode of the cnōc will just one shot trigger. Even if there's a held gate, it needs that next rising edge to trigger. If I go to ASR mode, we have attack, sustain, and release. So there might already be something of note at this time. Let's make this a bit more musical. I'm just going to add a bit of subtle vibrato to the voice. Bit more musical. Okay, so attack, sustain, release. We know that the gate output on the cnōc is generated from either the attack duration or the release duration, or attack phase or release phase. You can see the LEDs light to signify when it's in attack or when it's in release. So in one-shot cycle mode, or one-shot or cycling mode, these alternate, oscillate directly, as there's no seam between the rising ramp and the falling ramp. If we go to ASR mode, however, you can see that attack lights while it's in attack phase, while it's sustained, it both go off. So there's no gate produced when it's holding. So this is quite a useful mechanism, which we can see now. So as I'm holding down the cease and varying my input voltage, you can see that only when there's a duration for the attack or release ramps to follow, then the gates light. So if I bring these both all the way down, it means that we've got immediate voltage following of this variable incoming CV signal. If I bring up only the attack time, it means that we'll have a duration it's going to take for the voltage to match. And in this instance, it means that while they're unmatched, we've got a lit LED on the attack fader, which means we've got a gate derived during that transitional ramp. And likewise, if I do the same with release, it'll follow rising voltages immediately, and it'll take time for it to decay down back to zero, or to the resting voltage of the input source. So what does this mean in practice? Let's extend this voice a little bit more. I'll use this envelope signal. There we go. And I'm going to patch this to volt per octave. Instead of coming from the cease, I'm going to come from the harmony. So I'm now patching my volt per octave source from the harmony into this cnōc, the output envelope, reviewing on the scope, and then that's going to go to volt per octave on my main voice. I'll need an extra clock to give me melodic variation. So I'll use the cycling cnōc, use its trigger output, and use that to clock my sample and hold, which is then going to be melodically controlling okay, let's use a LFO as my sample source. Random voltage, quantized, controlling the pitch of my subtractive voice. And the volt per octave signal is actually patched through this cnōc. So let's look at the output from the harmony. There are built-in Slew limiters. So this is applying slew to the voltproctive signal. So no slew, we can see its steps. Increase the slew rate, we're getting glide to the target voltages. So I'll keep this off, and because we're running through the cnōc in ASR mode, if I bring up attack and release, we're getting the same effect. So in practice, the function generator in the cnōc in ASR mode actually operates as a slew limiter with a few extra perks, because as you can see in the slew limiter on the harmony, it's global. It's whatever direction the voltage has moved, it's going to slew it. Whereas with the cnōc, I could choose to have only slew on the release tails, meaning it's only going to descend. The slew is only going to be descending, or if it's attack, slew is only going to be ascending. If I go into exponential mode, then maybe a bit more similar to what the slew limiter on the harmony is doing, which is somewhat exponential in response. Okay, let's expand this voice a bit more. I'm using this cnōc as a clock, so I'm going to use the release shaped envelope to control my cutoff frequency. So in this context now, I'm using the harmony as voltproctive source through the cnōc. I've got slew on release tail only, not on the attack. So we can see the release LEDs blinking on and off. We're getting a very faint blip on the attack. I think that'll just be down to the minimum attack duration. If I add a tiny amount of slew at the harmony, that should eliminate that completely. So in this case, we should have no signal appearing at this gate when it's on attack now. Whereas with zero slew, yeah, there's maybe a slight blip that's visible. So now, if I switch over to the release side for this gate source, I've got a gate signal produced on every note jump that is descending. So there's no trigger and no slew on ascending jumps in the melody. So this can be a useful device for adding accent to a melodic pattern. I guess the term for this is technically a logic extraction. So I've got a variable voltage, I'm applying slew, but through that, in addition, I'm extracting logic, which is on state or off state, determined on whether it's an ascending jump in voltage or a descending jump in voltage. So logic extraction of descending state. I'll use this to trigger an extra cnōc down here. So I've now got a knock, knock, knock patch. And I'll use this as an accent to ping the wave folder. adding accent to any descending note, which, because it's a rigid timed pattern, and if it's, in this case I've got a ratio of clock to LFO, so there's a degree of periodicity to the melodic pattern. If this was a sequence, then you could curate your melody so that only on descending notes you're extracting this logic. So it's a way of, instead of having to rely on having a sequencer that has programmable gate outputs per step, or having to menu dive and dig into that, this is a way that you can use your voltage source and extract logic from it in analog. So what we could even do is use this signal trigger a second or fourth knock in this case, or a second accent driven one, and I'll use this to patch up a basic percussive voice. I'll use that to ping this 1047. In addition, the envelope's going to pull down the cutoff frequency. So if I just monitor that directly first. It's sitting in quite a nice place already. Okay, let's give it some oomph. I'm going to run it through the Larach, through the line to module, and that will give me a nice degree of saturation into the tan H. Cool. And I can use that as a source to sum into my main patch. Try summing it through the filter, that might. Seem to be a bit of flamming here, which is interesting. Because I've got end of cycle as my trigger source, so this should be. I inadvertently used it as a trigger delay in that instance, so I'm using end of cycle because I'm cascading envelopes here. So if I use the attack gate as my trigger source, then that's keeping everything aligned. Done now, because I'm using this cnōc as my cascaded trigger source for the kick, if I slow down the attack time of its envelope so that it's overlapping based on the timing of my sequence, it means that not every accented downbeat derived from the falling sequence is going to get through to this last knock. Whereas if I shorten my attack time, it means that every time this knock is clocked from an accent, it's going to trigger the kick. But this way I've got an accent coming through via this first knock, which is then further cascaded and triggering the kick accent. But there's a lot of control. So here's a slower movement over that timbre shift via the wave folder, slowing down the kick accents. So it ends up being quite an interesting compositional technique. Because it's a resonant filter kick, I can tune my fundamental to be in key with my main sequence. We've ended up with a knock 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 generative patch. Let's do a quicker patch example here. I'm going to use the knock fundamentally to control a percussive voice and make a kick drum using a resonant filter. To do that, I'll keep it in one-shot mode, set it exponential, and I want just a exponential release drop. I'll view this on the scope just for reference. And I'm going to send, well, first off, let's take out a gate control signal. So I'll use the gate output. I'm actually going to keep it on attack. As you might be able to see on camera, there's just a very slight blip on the attack portion based on the minimum attack time. Which, as a trigger signal, this will be more than enough to ping the filter. So if we now listen to this, there we go. So we've got our bit more of a classic 808 type fixed frequency resonant kick. And I'm going to use the envelope to pitch down the resonant or the fundamental frequency of the filter. There we go. So here the sharper impulse attack of the kick is coming from this quick pitch drop. I want to give this a bit more oomph. I've got a ladder here that I can run through the line to modular level as an extreme gain stage. I'll keep it all the way down, so that's unity, and then I'm going to pass it through the analog channel, the audio enhancer circuit. Yes, adding a bit more oomph. Cool. Okay, let's clock this from something. I'll cycle this knock and just use the trigger output of the attack phase. So now I can dial in and fine tune. The character of this kick. Sounding pretty punchy. Okay, let's make this a bit more chaotic. I'll use the end of cycle trigger output of my clock knock and sample and hold, and patch that to release. There we go. Off-timed drunken kick. Same random voltage source to overdrive a VCA. So control amplitude going into the random pattern hits and random accents. Over the saturation by controlling amplitude going into the saturator. So this is a couple of elements. I'm using the knock as a core of my kick voice, as well as using a second knock as a clock source and random generator in partner with a sample and hold. Somewhat performative and generative compositional element. Let's do a variation of this kick. I'll pull out the control aspect or simplify that so it's just going straight in. I'll bring the overdrive down a bit. And what I want to do is dial in a nice powerful, like a bass drop, like the big movie trailer type sound. So for this, there's a couple of tricks I'll need. I want the 1047 to be able to self-oscillate so that I get a nice long decay. I'll use the envelope source itself, mult that and send that to the resonance. That way I can ensure that it's going to keep oscillating through the bass drop. Let's move that down for reference. There we go. There we go, so I can vaguely see what's happening. Cool, okay, so the main drop aspect is working nicely, but there's a few things I'm going to need here. I want to have more of an impact on the first onset of this. So I'm going to actually cascade and double up and use two knocks here. So one will be doing this slower gradual pitch decline, which is a linear ramp. And then I'll have a second one that is doing the punchier like pitch pull down like the previous kick. So to do that, I want this to be controlled from a single knock. So I can use this gate output. If I mult that, use it to trigger the second cnōc. I mean, I could actually just use, I don't need to use the multiple, I could just use this to trigger, use this attack trigger as my strike. Although strike's less critical because it's pushing itself into self-oscillation. But this will help us retain some degree of, accented transient. So now I need to do a couple of things. I need to mix my envelope from my slow pitch drop. So it's this guy here. I need to mix that with my shorter impulse envelope. So this 1F all the way up, and this is the slow envelope, and if I bring it down, this will be the faster envelope. If I now use this going to FM, I need the multiple from the slow one, so I'm retaining that CV control over resonance. That's from here. Use a multiple. Done. Okay, so this should be my original slow drop. Bring this down here. There we go, that's working quite nicely. So we've got a nice slow drop coming from this linear ramp. And a bit more of a transient hit from the first envelope, or the shorter envelope, sorry. So it's a bit of a balancing act between the crossfade between two envelopes going in. Because as you change to one, you're changing the amplitude of the other. So if I want more of the short pulse, then I'm reducing the amplitude of my main drop. So I need to compensate with the modulation depth and maybe the fundamental. Throw this on a big sound system, big sub in a Dolby Atmos theater, then you've got your movie trailer bass drop as everyone's jumping out the helicopter with machine guns and all that. Okay, let's wrap things up with a patch example that's a little bit more involved. And that's going to use these two cnōcs together, and I'm going to have them interact with each other to create a quadrature pair. So quadrature is a term of relationship of phase between essentially either like two connected signals like this, or I guess a self-oscillating resonant filter is a good example of a quadrature signal, where, let's patch this up quickly for reference. That's self-oscillating. There you go. So this is my sine and cosine coming from the bandpass. So we've got a relationship of phase, where one is 90 degrees out of phase with the other. So we're basically going to be following the same premise, but creating a more versatile control signal pair from a pair of interconnected cnōcs. So let's look at this first cnōc on the oscilloscope. So we've got a triangle wave from the first one, and we're going to use this to interact with and control the second cnōc. I'll clock everything from this first channel. Actually, I'll have it running free. Okay, here's the second cycle. So if I have this cycling, they're completely unrelated parallel LFOs. So the way to have them interact is to use one to trigger the other. So I'll set them both to one-shot cycles so that we can see this happening in the most basic cascaded format. So I'm going to use the gate output set to the release tail, and that's going to trigger the second one. So as I trigger this, we're going to have a rising ramp from this first cnōc. It will then hit its peak, go into the descending ramp. So as that's descending, it's triggering the attack phase of the second. There we go. Zoom out of it. You can see this quadrature cascaded relationship. So as one's ascending and then going into descending, the second one follows. So where this gets interesting is when we create a closed loop and have the whole thing circular. So I'm going to do the same thing with the second cnōc, choose the release stage and use that to trigger my first cnōc. So we now have a somewhat stable oscillating relationship between the two, and they are out of phase with each other based on the attack and release rates. You can see that there's some degree of instability where, depending on the rate of one versus the other, we can end up with it spiraling off into faster oscillation rates, which can be pretty cool. Not necessarily always what we want, but there's some curious results that we can get from this. What I'm going to do, I'm going to bring in the XY scope so we can see the XY relationship of what these interacting signals are doing. So it should, at certain points, stabilize and draw a static shape. Or if I'm able to match my rates so that we're getting like closer to peak triangles on each one, we should get some sort of, circular movement or pattern. Yeah, if we compare this again to the quadrature sine cosine from a resonant filter, that should theoretically draw a perfect circle. Okay, so it looks very pretty, but how does it sound? What can we do with this? That's the main question. I'm going to patch up another subtractive voice. I'm going to use a wave folder from the cnōc and run that through a low pass filter. So I've got static pitch and I've got two timbre controls. I've got wavefold depth and I've got cutoff frequency. So if the cutoff's too far down, then we lose, there's not enough harmonics for the filter to remove. So I'll need to find a good balance point where this is clearly audible. And let's patch one at a time. So I'm going to use my first knock, patch that into the CV input over the wavefold. Wavefold depth. So that's a variable timbre. And I'm going to use my second knock to control the cutoff frequency. So we can clearly hear these two timbre parameters. Maybe if I go with bandpass output. Yeah, it's very much a balancing act in this case because if there's not enough harmonics, then we don't get enough obvious filtering. But you can hear how if I unpatch 1, we've got movement over the cutoff frequency. It's more noticeable resonance up versus our cutoff wavefold depth modulation. So as one goes up, the other one goes down, is the main takeaway. So as these are both oscillating triangles, let's change them into something being a bit more percussive. So we can see these interesting stall points that I'm able to create. Whereas one's oscillating full peak to peak, the other one's reduced in amplitude. So the way to stabilize this a bit more and get a bit more control is to limit the quadrature aspect a bit more. So instead of using the release tail gate of the second one as my clock source for the first, because that's where it's essentially soft syncing and causing there to be a lower peak to peak oscillation, if I use the end of cycle trigger as my re-trigger source for the first knock. So I'll take this out just now and just show it as one shot. I'll swap around the envelope roll so that so we've got filter cutoff from this first one. There's a bit more of a natural overlap. So we can hear wavefold depth going down as the filter cutoff opens up. And now if I patch my end of cycle trigger into first knock, the whole quadrature cycle is going to loop, but not fully integrated, so it's only after the end of the second knock has completed we'll get a reset of the cascade. So depending on the ratio of attack duration to release between the two, we can get some interesting shapes, but the whole thing is a is a cycle, it's a periodic CV loop. Swapping these back. That's an interesting starting point. What I'm going to do next is set one of the cnōc pair to cycle. I think in this case I'm going to set the first one to cycle while the second one's running slower. And to get an extra degree of control, I'm going to take the gate output from my release tail, or a tactile depending on where the toggle switch is, and use that to control my release time of the first cnōc. Try swapping these back again. Here we go. So I've now got my quick cycling envelope going to my wavefold depth. So we've got a really percussive, like sort of rapid fire percussive element, and then the longer cycle is opening up my cutoff frequency. And we end up with these interesting cycles within cycles. So this is the two envelopes going to two independent parameters, but what might be an interesting way to combine them is if I use a vinca or some sort of summing stage to sum these together, and then use it as a single more complex envelope. Let's view it on this channel. That's looking pretty cool. And I'll run that to, let's go with the cutoff frequency for this. To mult my first cnōc signal and send that back to the wavefold depth. So this way I've got a combination of this pair of envelopes summed together with different scaling and offset. So I've biased that first one down, and it's summing with this slower ramp, and that whole thing is opening up the filter cutoff. In addition, I've got the first more rapid cycles within cycles envelope opening my wave folder. got quite a nice rhythmic, repeating, multi-pluck, ratchet type effect. So let's add a melodic aspect to it. So I've got the end of cycle unpatched still, so let's use that as a clock source for sample and hold, and go the tried and tested sample and hold to a quantizer. Send that to my vote per octave. Get some note variation. What I'll do next, I'll use mult and split out this sample and hold source, and I can try patching it to different ramp stages of my complex quadrature envelope pair. So now as I get a higher note, like that one there, it's increasing the release time of my second knock, which is holding a longer sustain. So lower frequency notes are going to run faster. If I want to change that, I need to invert that signal. So I could run it into a Vinca, use it as an attenuverter, send that to my release. That's pretty cool. Bring up my cutoff frequencies fundamental, so we've got a bit more body to the sustained notes. That's pretty cool. Okay, let's expand this a little bit further. I'm going to use the Cruin as my primary oscillator, and let's use the cnōc as a through zero frequency modulation carrier. That's a bit more variation to the timbres. Split and attenuate my faster rate first knock, send that to volt per octave of the cnōc. It's adding a bit more aggressive plucking to the note attacks, because it's throwing up the index ratio of modulator to through zero carrier, which in this case the carrier being a complex wave shaper. endless tweaking, but generative patching using a pair of cnōcs.